Good day. Last 24 hours have provided more news about the situation, the conflict in Ukraine. But before I deal with that, there's one important piece of information that I gave inadvertently or wrongly in an earlier video, which I'd like to correct. Now, when I discussed the Russian missile strike on the ammunition dump in Khmelnytsky, the Ukrainian ammunition dump in Khmelnytsky, the one that resulted in that huge explosion and mushroom cloud, I reported, or I mentioned the fact that there'd been a spike in gamma radiation, which I speculated could be connected to the presence of depleted uranium shells in the Khmelnytsky ammunition dump when the missile struck. And in fact, the same claim was made on multiple sources where I took that information from. As a viewer has informed me, that actual gamma spike is well within normal parameters, and it actually predates the missile strike by a couple of days. It is, in other words, completely unrelated to the missile strike on the ammunition dump in Khmelnytsky. Another thing, by the way, that shows that one has to be extremely careful sometimes about the information one gets. Lots of reports about this gamma strike have been circulating all over the internet. It's extended right across Ukraine, in Poland as well, but straightforwardly, that information was wrong. And I'd like to thank the person who informed me in a private email about this. And as I said, this is an opportunity on my part to correct that mistaken information. The same correspondent did point out that the fact that there was no connection between this gamma radiation spike and the Khmelnytsky explosion doesn't in and of itself prove that there were no depleted uranium shells in the ammunition dump in Khmelnytsky. But I think it would be unwise to say that just because one can't prove that they were not there, that they must, in fact, have been there. That is, it seems to me, flawed logic, and we should not adopt it. All we can say is a major ammunition dump was destroyed, hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment was destroyed in that ammunition dump, and that's all we can say. So I'm going to move on to other topics, having, I hope, given a full correction. And by the way, I should apologize also for having given that wrong information in that previous video. But let's go to the situation as we have it now. There's been a lot more information over the last 24 hours, and we have verified information of dramatic events in Bakhmut. Indeed, it now seems clear that the Battle of Bakhmut is actually finally approaching its end. Now, as always, I have found the most useful overview of events in the tweets provided by Michael Valterson, the person with a Swedish military background, who has written some extremely helpful tweets about the overall state of the battle in Bakhmut. But before I mention that, I should say that there have been further comments by Prigozhin himself. He has said that the nest, this network of high-rise buildings that had been turned by the Ukrainians into a fortified position, that it's been completely cleared, that Wagner forces have advanced, I think he said, a further 200 meters in Bakhmut, and that there's now only two small areas of Bakhmut left to capture, and he put the total area of Bakhmut still under Ukrainian control at less than 1.5 square kilometers. Now, I'm going to say something else about Prigozhin's statements, which is that I've noticed that over the last couple of days, the official news agency, the official Russian news agency, which used to report his comments on a regular basis, routinely, whenever he made a statement, it used to report them. It has now stopped doing so. A further indicator, in my opinion, that he is no longer in good standing with the authorities in Moscow. TASS has clearly been given instructions to stop broadcasting Prigozhin's statements, or at least to stop republishing them on his website. Now, that might have implications in the future. We will see, but it isn't affecting the pace of the battle, the nature of the fighting in Bakhmut itself. And I will now turn to Valterson, who provided last night with 2 very helpful tweets. And the first one reads, "The things go fast now in Bakhmut after last night's and then today's fierce fighting within the constructor area. Ukrainian forces retreated southwards to the Dominoes area. The Ukrainian armed forces will try to hang on to the blue-shaded apartment blocks in the southeastern constructor area as long as possible. Otherwise, they would open the way for attacks in the rear towards the children's hospital." And he's given a map, and he gives us very helpful indicators of where all these places are. And then he goes on to say, after that, the entire western part of Bakhmut could be attacked from the rear and would collapse. And then he goes on to say, some of the contested city blocks adjacent to the western part of the constructor must also be abandoned by now. Mopping up will probably be finished tomorrow in the constructor area, and the fighting start in the southeast corner, and the fighting will start in the southeast corner amongst the blue-shaded houses. Blue-shaded refers to his own map. And he goes on to say that in this area, the Russian advance is maybe even faster than I thought in my fastest projections. I thought that constructor would take 2 to 4 days to capture. Now it seems it will take a maximum of 2 days. And then Valterson, a short time later, provided a further update, and he said that the Wagner forces have now captured most of the citadel. That's the area that I think Prigozhin means when he talks about the nest, north of Yuvileyna Street, in the last remnant in the nest around the Peremorga cinema. Mopping up has now finished. The main part of the constructor area and a small undefendable part northwest of the constructor has been abandoned by the Ukrainian military and is now under Russian control. Ukrainian forces still hold on to the southwest corner of the constructor area to avoid a rear attack on the children's hospital. That's what he said in his previous tweet, and a total collapse of the private sector within single houses in the west. I had thought that it would take 2 to 4 days to clear constructor, but it took 1 day, with the exception of the southwest corner. Not much is left of Ukrainian Bakhmut anymore. So that's from Valterson. As I said, he is somebody who obviously speaks the languages. He's followed the events very carefully. He's been able to assemble and discuss these events with great accuracy. He provides maps. He also comments on the fact that Suriyak Maps, which is another site which provides maps of the fighting, has confirmed his own information. And as I said, that gives us a sense of where we stand with the fighting in Bakhmut as of late yesterday. And all the indications are that the Wagner advances are continuing. So yesterday, Valterson was talking about Bakhmut needing 5 to 10 days to be cleared entirely of Ukrainian forces. He hasn't revised that timetable entirely, but perhaps based on what he says, it might take sooner than that. We will see. In the meantime, what has been going on the flanks? We've had very little information about the latest fighting there, except what Pushilin said yesterday, that the Russians have reinforced the flanks, and though the situation there remains tense, the situation seems to be overall stable. What I will say is this: we're getting more dribbles of information now from various sources, including a report I have seen, which I can't, by the way, verify or corroborate, but which is alleged to come from a NATO source, which appears to suggest that the Ukrainian military actually suffered a massive debacle in its initial attack on the 12th of May. This is the day when Ukraine, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, launched fierce attacks right across the line, trying perhaps to break through to Soledar. The Russian Defense Ministry says that at one point 1,000 Ukrainian troops and 40 armored vehicles were attempting to break through to Soledar. The Russian Ministry of Defense also said that the Ukrainians suffered extremely heavy casualties in that fighting. It spoke about 540 of those 1,000 troops having been killed or wounded, and it also said that 30 of those armored vehicles, those 40 armored vehicles, including 8 tanks, were destroyed in the fighting. So that was what the Russian Ministry of Defense said, and I was really very cautious at the time about accepting the truth of all of this. But dribbles of reports have now come through that the fighting on the 12th of May was indeed extremely intense, and that the Ukrainian losses might actually have been understated. If one believes these reports about the NATO source, then Ukraine might have suffered losses, the loss of equivalent to the destruction of an entire regiment on that one single day. That would be more than John Helmer was talking about in that article for Dancing with Bears that I discussed also a couple of days ago. So Helmer put the number of Ukrainian losses on the 12th of May at about 1,200 killed. This report suggests that they might even have been higher than that. Now that would certainly make it the single worst day of losses that Ukraine has experienced, not just since the current wave of fighting began on the 24th of February 2022, but in the entire history of the conflict, going all the way back to the launch by Ukraine of its original anti-terrorist operation, as it called it, back in the spring of 2014. So extremely severe losses apparently suffered by Ukraine over the course of that attack on the 12th of May, which have been compounded by further losses which have taken place since then. And there's been some further reports which have said that though Ukraine did indeed gain control of some fields, what has happened is that the Ukrainians are suffering further losses because these fields have brought Ukrainian troops into the open, and that they're now being heavily targeted in these fields by Russian artillery, and that this is increasing their losses and is making it very, very difficult for them to retain control of some of the territory they did capture. And as I said, I think in my 2 previous videos, it looks like they've been captured. They've been forced back in some of the places that they'd previously captured. Now, again, I can't corroborate all of this, but it did remind me of a study of the fighting carried out by a US Marine officer, Mercouris, as he called himself. He gave that name in an article that was published in the US Marine Corps Journal some months ago, which I discussed at some length at the time when it appeared, and which I found an interesting study of the war. And Mercouris said that one of the things that the Russians have been doing over the course of the conflict, and he was writing quite a while back, some months back, was that from time to time they pull back and lure the Ukrainians into fire zones that they've already planned out with their artillery. They know exactly where all the important locations are situated in these fire zones. And that has enabled them to increase substantially the losses that they're able to inflict on the Ukrainians. And that was what Mercouris said. Now, I wonder if, drawing on these same reports that we've had, these reports we've had about the fighting on the flanks in Bakhmut, whether the Russians didn't use exactly the same tactic, that after some initial fighting, they retreated, abandoned some open fields and wooded areas, lured the Ukrainians in, and then launched heavy artillery strikes on them, causing very heavy losses to the Ukrainian forces, bringing the Ukrainian advance to a stop, and then, when the moment came, pushing back. And that, for the record, also seems to me reasonably consistent with Simplicius, the thinker's claim that these places that the Russians pulled back from were what he calls crumple zones. Anyway, all this, I just pass it on. As I said, I can't verify or corroborate any of this. But for the moment, there doesn't seem to be any concern on the Russian side about the situation on the flanks of Bakhmut. There's been no reports of any important news. The last report of the Ministry of Defense about the fighting in Bakhmut, published yesterday, said that it was as follows: in the Donetsk direction, the assault detachments, that's to say the Wagner troops, continue to conduct offensive actions against the enemy in the western part of Artyomivsk, which is of course Bakhmut. The units of the Yug, the south group of forces, held the enemy by covering the flanks of the assault units. The most difficult situation was near Krasnoye, that's Ivanivska, where the units of the 4th Motorized Rifle Brigade, that is the same unit whose commanding officer, Colonel Makarov, was killed some days ago, have repelled 10 Ukrainian attacks. So the forces, the defense here is still being conducted for the moment by the 4th Motorized Rifle Brigade, fighting, this is the southern pincer of the Russian forces, the southern flank, fighting the reconstituted Azov Brigade. There's been heavy fighting there, but apparently no Ukrainian breakthroughs, and the fighting is still close to Ivanivska itself. And then the Russian Defense Ministry goes on to say the enemy losses were over 70 Ukrainian servicemen, 1 infantry fighting vehicle, and 2 armoured personnel carriers. Now that is significantly less than what the Russian Defense Ministry was talking about in the earlier fighting there, which suggests that though fighting is still going on, especially on the southern flank, it is less intense than it was. And then it says that operational, tactical and army aviation, as well as the artillery of the U group of forces, inflicted fire damage on the enemy units close to Chasov Yar and Bogdanovka. These are these two small towns located near to Bakhmut, which is still under Ukrainian control. And then it says that as a result of an airstrike, a road overpass used to transport enemy reinforcements to Bakhmut, Artyomivsk, has been destroyed close to Krasnoye, in other words, Ivanivska. Russian aviation have made 9 sorties in the area during the day. That was yesterday. This is a report from yesterday. The group's artillery has performed 74 firing missions. So most of the fighting on the southern flank, the Russians have destroyed a road overpass, interrupting the bridge, breaking the bridge. The Ivanivskaya road continues to be all but unusable, and the Russian Air Force has been operating in the area. It doesn't look as if, from this report, that there's been any breakthroughs, that there's been severe fighting between the 4th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Russian Army and the reconstituted Azov Brigade on the southern front. But overall, the impression given is that the Russians are holding their positions. So that's the situation as far as I can see on the flanks. If there's any more news, no doubt we will find it. But on the basis of what both Prigozhin and perhaps more objectively Valterson are telling us, the state of the fighting in Bakhmut for the Ukrainian forces there is now fast becoming desperate. Their most important remaining fortified position in Bakhmut, the nest, as Prigozhin calls it, the citadel, as Valterson calls it, has fallen. There's very little left of Ukrainian Bakhmut anymore, to use Valterson's words. Before I continue and leave the topic of Bakhmut, there is one final point which slightly mystifies me. Just throw it open. Perhaps some people in the chat or the threads or in a private email can clarify it for me. A couple of weeks ago, I was hearing a great deal about a structure in Bakhmut called the Avant-Garde Stadium. I was led to think that it was a very important fortified position held by Ukraine. At some point, clearly, the Wagner forces captured it. I wonder when and how it was done. But that's all I'm going to say about the fighting there. Anyway, there has been fighting in other places. It is now confirmed that this withdrawal of this brigade from Marinka, Ukrainian brigade from Western Marinka, is indeed a rotation. The Ukrainians aren't pulling out of Western Marinka. The suggestion that they were retreating from Marinka is wrong. The Russians do say that this brigade, a paratroop brigade apparently, has suffered 70% losses and has been all but destroyed, which may be true, but again, we can't verify it. But the fighting in Marinka goes on. And Russian sources, by the way, also said that in the Avdiivka area yesterday, Ukraine launched a counterattack, which was able to recapture some stretches of road leading into Avdiivka, though overall one gets the sense that the situation for Ukraine in Avdiivka is becoming steadily and gradually worse and worse. Let me reiterate again a point I have made many times, both about the fighting in the flanks at Bakhmut, the fighting in Avdiivka and other places. This has been an intensely fought war. Fighting has been fought very much in an attritional way. Inevitably, there is ebb and flow. Sometimes one side gains ground and then loses it. This is entirely typical of the way the fighting has been conducted in these places for many months now. There is never, or at least not for a long time, has there been an advance continuously by one side in one direction. But overall, the pattern is clear. It is the Russians who slowly, incrementally, steadily gain ground. It is the Ukrainians who slowly, steadily, incrementally lose it. Now, there were many more big Russian missile and airstrikes across Ukraine yesterday. And it's clear, by the way, that the Russian grouping in the Black Sea, naval grouping in the Black Sea, has been reinforced significantly, and that the Russian Navy is now heavily involved, launching Kalibr missiles at Ukraine, and both Russian tactical and strategic aviation have been launching cruise missiles, and of course we've had Kinzhal missile strikes on the Patriot missile battery in Kiev. And there has been an enormous amount of obfuscation about what happened in the attack on the Kiev, with all sorts of remarkable claims made by Ukraine and some more realistic claims made by the Russians. And one thing I have to say is this. Broadly speaking, the British media for once reported the events in Kiev, or so it seemed to me, the attack on the Patriot battery, relatively accurately, with one exception, which is The Guardian, which ignored the Russian reports, largely ignored the Russian reports yesterday, or seemed to discount the Russian reports that a Patriot missile battery had been hit, and took as true Ukrainian claims that they were able to shoot down 6 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has ridiculed the last claim. They said that Ukraine claims to have shot down more Kinzhal missiles than were launched, which I'm sure is true. And incidentally, the Russian Defense Ministry also said that, again, that Ukraine repeatedly claims that it has shot down more missiles than the Russians, of all kinds, than the Russians have launched in any particular missile strike. This is the second time, to my knowledge, that the Russians have recently made that claim. The first time it was made by an anonymous Russian Air Force official to TASS. I spoke about it recently. This time it's been made rather more openly by the Russian Defense Ministry. And I've no doubt this is true. The Russian Defense Ministry also says that the Ukrainians don't seem to know at any one particular time which missiles the Russians are using. So I get to say again, up to now, I have followed Ukrainian claims about the numbers of Russian missiles that have been launched by the Russians on any particular day. So quite often, as I remember, during the Russian missile offensive against the Ukrainian energy system, the Ukrainians claimed that the Russians were launching 80 to 100 missiles on one particular day. I think it's important to realize now that the Russians are saying that they never launched anything like that number of missiles on any particular day. These are Ukrainian exaggerations. the Ukrainians have been exaggerating the number of Russian missiles that have been launched in order to excuse the fact that most of the Russian missiles managed to get through, and that there is, in effect, a major disconnect between the number of air defense missiles that Ukraine launches and the number of attacks, missiles that the Russians are able to get through and strike their targets. So, to give an example, if 12 Russian missiles get through and strike their targets, and the Russians have launched, say, 15, the Ukrainians will say that the Russians launched 80 missiles and that they were able to shoot down 65 in order to excuse the fact that they launched, let's say, 120 air defense missiles to relatively little effect. So that's what the Russians are saying, and I strongly suspect, by the way, that they are right. Now, let's go and discuss what the two sides said about the missile strike on the Patriot battery yesterday. And I'm going to go first to what the Russian Ministry of Defense actually said, and I'm taking this from the official translation from the Russian Ministry of Defense, published on its website, and it's as I said, the official English translation. And this is what it said. The Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation launched a combined attack with long-range, precision-guided air and sea-based weapons against Ukrainian units, as well as depots of ammunition, weapons, and military equipment supplied by Western countries. That's the entirety of the attack across the whole of Ukraine. The goal of the attack has been reached. All the assigned targets have been neutralized. That's what the Russian Ministry of Defense says. We don't know whether that is true, but that's what it says. Then we come to the key sentence. US manufactured Patriot surface-to-air missile system has been struck by Kinzhal hypersonic glide vehicle in Kiev. Now, a number of points here. First of all, the Kinzhal is not a glide vehicle. It may be a hypersonic missile, but it doesn't function as a glide vehicle. The Russians are being, I think here, probably intentionally somewhat manipulative in their use of language. The Kinzhal is, in fact, as I understand it, an adaptation, an air-launched adaptation of the Iskander ballistic missile. But as I said, I'm not going to go into the technical details. But the more important words are these. US manufactured Patriot surface-to-air missile system has been struck by Kinzhal vehicle in Kiev. The Russians are not claiming that they have destroyed an entire Patriot system. That's not what they're saying. They said that they've struck the system with a Kinzhal missile, and that this happened in Kiev. And the United States has confirmed this, and in fact we're getting quite a lot of dribbles of information now from US sources as to what happened. Firstly, a number of US officials yesterday spoke to Reuters. They spoke anonymously. They said that a Patriot missile battery was indeed damaged over the course of the missile strike. The United States is assessing the damage, but so far it doesn't think that the entire system, the entire Patriot system, needs to be taken back to the United States for repair, which, to my mind, is somewhat evasive. If the entire system had been destroyed, how would it be taken back to the United States to repair? And then we had a further report which suggested that the strike, the Kinjal strike on the Patriot system, took place in an airfield near Kiev, where 3 launchers of the Patriot missile system were located, and that one launcher was completely destroyed, another launcher was damaged, and a third launcher was undamaged. That is consistent with the information that the Russian Ministry of Defense has provided. And by the way, we have video evidence of what happened, and the Ukrainians are very upset about the existence of this video evidence. They made several attempts to try to conceal it, to suppress it. They've apparently tracked down and are now taking some kind of legal action against the person who took the video, who I understand is a woman. I hope all turns out well for her. And I also understand that there have been other attempts by Ukraine to suppress filming of missile strikes on Kiev, webcams and rather CCTV cameras and things like that have been switched off, and there have been attempts also to impound multiple evidence that's now appeared all over the internet, but prevent pictures appearing of the various items of debris, canisters and things of this sort that have been littering Kiev, including, by the way, the zoo, most of which, the vast majority of which, appear to show debris from surface-to-air missiles, air defense missiles, including specifically, by the way, the Patriot, and this has enabled some people to identify the Patriot missiles actually used, and they appear to be the most advanced version of the Patriot missile system, which I just wanted to say because there was some speculation as to which system Ukraine had been provided with. And of course, the most dramatic film is the film that lots of people have seen, which has been mentioned by many people in the thread of my previous video, and which even some sections of the media in the West have acknowledged. The one that shows 30 missiles, 30, some say 32. One British media report said only 20, but I think the consensus is it was around 30 missiles launched one after the other over the space of 2 minutes. And then there was an explosion. Some people believe that there were 2 flashes. And the most likely explanation is that Ukraine, the Ukrainian Patriot system, the people who were defending it, its operators, understood that it was being targeted, that attempts were made to try to protect the system by sending up a barrage of missiles, but these failed, and at least 2 Kinjal missiles struck and, as I said, destroyed one launcher, damaged another. Ukraine, by the way, Yuri Ignat, the official who apparently either commands or acts as the spokesman for Ukraine's air defense forces, says that Ukraine has a total of 8 launchers dispersed at various locations. As I said, there seem to have been 3 at this particular airfield, and as I said, one of them was destroyed and one of them was damaged. Now, I understand that we're talking about 4 missiles per launcher. So conceivably what happened is that this particular launcher, this set of 3 launchers, either reloaded and fired very quickly within the space of 2 minutes, which some people suggest might not be correct, or conceivably some of these other launchers, the total 8 launchers would produce 32 missiles. They're all located in this general area, and that they all tried to launch some kind of barrage of missiles to intercept these Kinjals, these 2 Kinjals, or whatever other missiles or decoys the Russians were using in this attack. But the 2 Kinjals at least got through. And I think this is perhaps as good a reconstruction of the attack as we have seen. The fact is that today, Yuri Ignat has been talking again. He says we mustn't worry about the state of the Patriot system. He's not denying that the system suffered damage. It's clear that it did. It's clear that at least 1 launcher has been destroyed, 1 apparently seriously damaged. The system, the Patriot system, is becoming degraded, and of course the number of missiles that it operates has been depleted over the course of a few minutes by at least 30. So overall, a successful strike by the Russians. And as I said, I think we've been able to reconstruct fairly well what happened because of these video pictures, which have made it very difficult, in fact, all but impossible, for Ukraine to continue with its story that all 6 Kinjal missiles were destroyed, and that Ukraine achieved some glorious victory, some great victory in this missile attack on Kiev yesterday. So I've gone into this in some detail because, as I said, we've had a lot of information, largely thanks to those films. That film of what took place. Ukraine is now going to try and tighten its control of film. We mustn't assume that we're going to get film corroboration of what has happened over the course of a missile strike again in future. The Russians have provided their own account of the events that took place. As I said, their account corresponds with what American sources are telling us. They're not saying that the entire Patriot system in Kiev was destroyed. They're saying that a Patriot surface-to-air missile system was struck. And that is exactly what appears to have happened. And for the rest, if there had not been all of that video evidence, which essentially refuted Ukrainian denials, we would still have those denials, and the Western media would still be going on with them. So this incident is useful for 2 reasons. Firstly, it shows that the Patriot system can be defeated and has been defeated and can be damaged and destroyed, exactly as many reporters and analysts have been saying for weeks. That's one thing. And secondly, that the Patriot system that Ukraine has been supplied with has already been degraded, significantly degraded, just a few weeks after it was delivered and put into service. Second thing. But the third thing is that we must not accept accounts by Ukraine of what happens over the course of these missile strikes. They are not reliable. And we've seen that, by contrast, Russian reports, at least on this occasion, have been corroborated by the information we've obtained from the scene. So, there we are. An interesting series of events. I've gone into them in some detail. Where does this leave us overall with the state of the war? Well, yesterday, one of President Zelensky's top advisors came out and said again that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has been postponed. And the reason he gave for the postponement of the counteroffensive is now the standard one which Ukraine repeatedly gives. Ukraine doesn't have enough weapons. It needs more armored vehicles, more tanks. France has apparently agreed to supply more what it calls tanks, which are these AMX 10 RC wheeled vehicles, which are not tanks, by the way, but France has promised to supply more. It had apparently agreed to supply 40 of them previously, but Macron has now said that he's going to supply more. And we've also had further announcements from Britain, France, and the Netherlands that they're going to create a fighter alliance for Ukraine to train Ukrainian fighter pilots. Except, of course, that there is a problem with this, because of these three countries, the only one, as I understand it, that operates the F-16, which is the fighter jet that Ukraine apparently is hoping to obtain, the only one is the Netherlands. Britain and France do not operate F-16s. And there's an admission in an editorial in the Daily Telegraph that it would take anyway years to get Ukraine in a position where it could operate these Western fighter jets effectively. Training pilots, getting them to the point where they're able to use their aircraft effectively, operate them as part of an integrated air defense system. That would take years to do. And of course, Ukraine doesn't have those years. So, a gesture. And we have also had promises from the British to supply more long-range missiles and presumably Storm Shadows. And there's been a report that Britain has now supplied Ukraine with 200 Storm Shadow missiles, cruise missiles, and that it's apparently promised to supply a further 400. 400 Storm Shadow missiles would be the greater part of Britain's stock of Storm Shadow cruise missiles. Of course, you could make more, manufacture more. I don't know how long it takes or how complex it is to manufacture Storm Shadow missiles. I doubt that it could be done very easily or very quickly. I doubt that it can keep pace with Ukraine's use of these missiles, even though President Macron of France now says that France will also supply some of these missiles to Ukraine. Apparently in France they're called Scalp missiles, but it's essentially the same system. Well, it has been used in missile strikes against Lugansk city in northern Donbass. But the Russians yesterday, as well as claiming that they'd struck the Patriot missile system defending Kiev, made a really most extraordinary claim. They said, and this is in the same report as the one which discussed the attack on the Patriot missile system, they said that air defense forces intercepted 7 Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles, 3 HARM anti-radar missiles, and 7 HIMARS multiple launch rocket system projectiles. Now, the HARM missiles, which are American supplied and which are intended to destroy radars, that they're not working very well. I think that has been generally acknowledged for some time. They're systems which have proved disappointing. They have not affected or impacted the Russian air defense system to any great degree, and the Russians seem to have no difficulty shooting them down. And that the Russians are able to shoot down 7 HIMARS rockets, well, we've had admissions in the US media for some time now that the HIMARS system, whatever it achieved briefly back in the summer and early autumn, has now been very significantly degraded, and that its signals, its GPS signals, are being jammed, and that the Russians have found means to shoot it down, and that it is, in effect, a shadow of the system that it once was. But that the Russians claim to have shot down 7 Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles over the space of a single day is a remarkable claim. Now, can I say once more that I have no way of independently corroborating or verifying this claim? But we have seen that Russian claims to have shot down HARM missiles and HIMARS missiles are now being corroborated, especially in the case of the HIMARS, by American sources. And we've also seen that the Russian claim in this very same report to have struck a Patriot missile system in Kiev has been corroborated by American sources. So, the Russians are telling the truth about that. Perhaps, they're also telling the truth about shooting down the 7 Storm Shadow cruise missiles. I don't know, and I don't want to pretend that I do. The Russians did claim some days ago that they'd shot down 1 Storm Shadow missile, and now they're claiming that they've shot down a further 7. If this is correct, then Storm Shadow is failing. And of course, the Russians also claimed some days ago that they shot down a Sukhoi-24, Ukrainian Sukhoi-24, and a MiG-29 that had launched one of these Storm Shadow missiles at Lugansk, or perhaps 2 of them. And it made a similar claim in this same report about fighter aviation of Russian aerospace forces have shot down Su-24 and Su-25 aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force near Varvarovka and Krasnoarmeysk, Donetsk People's Republic. Conceivably, the Sukhoi-24 was also involved in launching some of these Storm Shadow cruise missiles that the Russians claim, of which the Russians claim to have shot down 7. I'm going to say straight away that I think that the Russians are not underestimating the capability of the Storm Shadow cruise missile. But as I said on numerous occasions, intercepting and destroying subsonic ground tracking cruise missiles is something that the Russians have been working on since the late 1970s, when the United States first planned to deploy Tomahawk cruise missiles in Europe. And the Storm Shadow is just or so it seems to me, a version of this kind of cruise missile, though one that has been adapted for tactical use through its launch by tactical aircraft. And personally, though I can't corroborate this claim, 7 of these missiles have been shot down by the Russians over the course of a single day. I think it is not impossible, and it seems to me plausible, that some of these missiles are being shot down and that over time more of them will be. So again, a system which some people perhaps expected would be a game changer. It's not looking as if it is in fact a game changer system. Now, there's been some further information from Seymour Hersh about apparent diplomatic activity. He has written an article which claims that a group of East European countries led by Poland and including the Baltic states is now urging President Zelensky to try and find some kind of way to end the war with Russia, and that might even include, if necessary, President Zelensky himself stepping down. Now, this is a very strange report, and I'm not sure whether Seymour Hersh is right about this, given that Poland and the Baltic states up to now have been the most fervid advocates of Russia's of Ukraine, supporters of Ukraine, have been the strongest supporters of military confrontation with Russia on behalf of Ukraine, that they provided Ukraine with the largest amount of weapons of any European country, that they stripped their forces of weapons and all of that kind of thing. So if they're now urging Zelensky to talk peace, well, this is a 180-degree U-turn on their part. And I'm a bit skeptical of this report, but it is from Seymour Hersh. And if this is indeed happening, why might it be happening? Well, Seymour Hersh suggests that it might be because of concerns about massive refugee flows from Ukraine and the pressure in these countries of refugees from Ukraine. And I'm sure that plays a part in it. But I'm going to suggest that the reason, if this is really the case, that this might be happening, is that there's concerns about the progress of the war. Bakhmut looks like it's about to fall. The counterattack that Ukraine launched around Bakhmut, we don't have full confirmation of all of this. Ukraine's not said very much about this counterattack around Bakhmut, but reports are starting to suggest that it was a complete disaster, that Ukraine suffered enormously heavy losses and failed to achieve any effective result. Now, just to make one observation, we've had reports, one from Helmer, one allegedly from this NATO officer. These are unconfirmed reports, but Helmer spoke about Ukraine suffering losses of 1,200 men killed. The NATO officer spoke about Ukraine suffering losses of 1,700 men killed, regiments worth of soldiers, all in the space of a few days. I read a report in the Daily Telegraph some weeks ago about how Ukraine might lose 5,000 to 10,000 men in the event of an attack on the fortified Russian positions in Zaporozhye as part of its spring offensive. That seemed to be, the concern was that 10,000 might be that seemed to be the worst case scenario, that 5,000 to 10,000 men killed might be the price to pay for achieving some kind of breakthrough. And I was horrified at that number. Well, these are uncorroborated reports from Helmer and possibly from this NATO official, but if they are true, then bear in mind that Ukraine has lost, apparently, already over 1,000 men, perhaps as closer to 2,000 men killed in a few days in and around Bakhmut, launching a much smaller counterattack against positions, Russian positions, which were not fortified. Now, it may be, as I said, that these reports are wrong, but I do think that Ukrainian losses have been high, and they might cast further doubts upon the viability of any offensive that Ukraine launches against Russian positions, where the Russians have fortifications and are in a stronger position to repel the attacks when they are made. So, that might factor in to some of these calculations. We just don't know. So it could be that all of this, taken together with President Zelensky's increasing unwillingness to launch this offensive, as I said, we've just been told that it's going to be postponed again, that might be what is now causing the worry, that is what is leading to the decision by the Eastern European states to start talking about the need to compromise. Having said that, I want to stress again, this is a surprising claim, at least to me, by Helmer and by Seymour Hersh. I'm not absolutely convinced it's correct. We'll just have to wait and see. Now, there has been one other very extraordinary and remarkable development. President Biden has been supposed to be going to the Far East. The first was to Japan, as I understand it, to meet with the G7. I understand that meeting is going to go ahead. But remarkably, he has announced that he's rushing back to the United States after this G7 meeting to deal with the debt ceiling crisis. And he's going to skip the meeting of the Quad, the informal grouping that the United States is trying to cobble together against China, which was supposed to be taking place in Papua New Guinea. And Biden has explained this by saying that this is all because there is now a looming crisis over the debt ceiling. Well, I'm going to say straight away, I don't believe that. I think a meeting of the Quad is an extremely important event. It brings together the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. As I said, the major allies of the United States, or at least countries that the United States wants to make its allies in the confrontation with China. The United States has given heavy priority over the last, ever since the new administration took office, to confronting China in the Pacific region. And I would have thought that for the President of the United States to skip a meeting of the Quad is a pretty remarkable thing. And yes, I do take the debt ceiling issue seriously, but I still think that there will be a compromise. And I think most people do. And I can't really believe that President Biden himself is needed in Washington to broker that compromise. So why, if it's nothing to do with the debt ceiling, has President Biden decided to skip this meeting? I'm going to suggest that there is a straightforward reason, and that is growing difficulties now in this relationship between India and the United States. And we've had some further news from India about its oil purchases from Russia. And they're very indicative. They provide a fairly interesting account of the situation in Indian-Russian trade. And essentially, I'm going to read this. Now, this is taken from, I've taken this from Slavyangrad, but I understand that it is published elsewhere. I've no doubt at all about the accuracy of these figures. And this is what they say. India, having finished its financial year, which they have from April to March, has published interesting oil statistics. Imports from Russia came to 50.84 million tons. And Russia was first place. Russia was India's major exporter of oil. Russia was major supplier of oil over the period from April to March. From Iraq, which was in second place, it was 50.3 million tons. Russia was paid $31.02 billion, I believe in rupees, by the way, and Iraq $33.37 billion. So Iraq supplied marginally, very marginally, slightly less oil than Russia, but was paid very slightly more. And the point made, and this is by Slavyangrad, says this is a clear demonstration of the inefficiency of the price ceiling and the untruth of the story about crazy discounts for Russian oil. The average annual price is $80 with a small tail of dollars per barrel. Given the shipments to India have risen sharply since December, the last 4 months should account for at least half of the annual exports. I think that's right, by the way. And then it turns out that not only does it not smell of any ceiling, but the prices for recent months form a discount of 10 to 15%, not a quarter or a third or a half, as Western commentators have been talking about. And I think this is right. India is buying oil from Russia in growing quantities, and the talk about price ceilings and discounts is clearly wildly exaggerated. I would say that there are reports that India is paying for much of this oil in rupees, and that Russia is now building up large reserves of Indian rupees and isn't quite sure what to do with them, and that this has been an issue between India and Russia. Russia wants less payment in rupees. So it can't be said that this is a straightforward trade for the Russians. And of course, the Indians may not be giving the Russians such a big discount for the oil, but if they're paying for the oil in their own currency, well, that is a good thing for them. And perhaps it's more important than a mere discount. But it does give us a sense of what's happening. And yes, I do accept that for the Russians, trade in rupees has its disadvantages for the moment, though we should not underestimate the fact that over time, the Russians may find that they do actually have lots of things that they want to buy from India in rupees. And there are particular consumer goods, which India does produce, for example, which the Russians might be interested in buying. Not just tea, of which the Russians consume a lot, as anybody who's visited the country would know, but the many handicrafts and light consumer goods that India does produce in large quantities and of which it could produce many more. And by the way, pharmaceutical products also, but that's a big story which I don't want to get drawn into. And Russia, anyway, is aiming for self-sufficiency in pharmaceuticals. But the key point to make from all of this is that Russian-Indian trade is very strong. It is booming. In fact, I saw a report, which may be true, that Russia has now become India's second biggest importer after China, which would be a dramatic change, by the way. Now, I can very well understand why, given the fact that India has forged this economic alliance, if you like, with, or at least let's not call it alliance, trade relationship with Russia to this extent, that this might be very embarrassing and inconvenient for President Biden, and might be enough in itself to explain why he is disinclined to meet with Prime Minister Modi in a Quad meeting in Papua New Guinea. So I have to say, without discounting the importance of the debt ceiling negotiations, my own guess is that geopolitical factors played the bigger role. It looks as if the Quad, at least so it seems to me, is beginning to crack. Anyway, that's where we are today. Lots going on in the world, as we've seen. Another utterly bizarre event. You could say from the sublime to the ridiculous, or from the tragic to the tragicomic. We've had Liz Truss, our former British Prime Minister, travelling to Taiwan, talking about how Britain must support Taiwan against China. The Chinese have written a scathing commentary about this in Global Times. I will come to that, no doubt, in my next programme, though I doubt that anybody takes Liz Truss any longer particularly seriously. I don't think the Chinese should, by the way. But there it is. That's me for the day. More from me soon. Just to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via our Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where we have all our amazing merchandise, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please don't forget, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.